Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks for putting this together. And welcome, honors community. Um, I'm glad that we can get together today. I wish we were together face to face, but this is we'll have to do, right? A little background regarding this talk, how it came about. In the last, which is no mystery to you folks, in the last 8 to 10 months, in my own life, it's the first time I witnessed or experienced or shared with the rest of the world truly, I'd say, collective actions. Um, Mask wearing was a collective action, uh, and I think that's the first stage. And the second stage looks like is vaccination. And by collective action, I mean something that everyone expected everyone else to do. I'm not talking about full compliance here, rather that somehow we were sharing this experience with everyone, that you walk out of your house or you walk into a gas station, you put the mask on. It's a shared action for some kind of collective good, namely, in that case, stopping the spread of uh, COVID-19. And it struck me, and it still strikes me, and it might have struck you as well, that this is something rather unique and maybe unprecedented. I was thinking, I was analogizing that maybe the next time this happens, I hope, frankly, it doesn't happen with a pandemic in my lifetime or your lifetime. But maybe, for instance, if there's an alien invader that threatens the entire globe, we'll see collective action. So that's what I mean by collective action, that we're all doing something for the collective good. So this experience really has struck me, and in a way, I think altered my view about a lot of things. Um, Secondly, my wheelhouse, my little sort of avocation area, is moral theory, ethical theory. I've spent most of my life studying at least moral theory in academics, and I currently teach at MSU, and I've been teaching for 20 years, the Good and Evil course. I think probably the best title of all courses at MSU, Good and Evil, or Problems of Good and Evil. Um, it's really an intro ethics course, and I that's been it's always on my brain, on my head, when I was thinking about it, and so I thought I'd sort of combine the two, and I've had personal concerns in the last 2 3 months myself regarding once the vaccine became available, and now apparently Johnson and Johnson, if you heard about this, has developed a third one, which apparently does not need a booster. That's what they claim, at least. So companies like wildfire, right, are producing in record time in a year. Can you imagine in a year developing a vaccine? It's unprecedented. But what's worried me a little bit in the last 2 or 3 months is while vaccination rollout is, albeit slower than expected, but still rather rapid, individuals may decline getting vaccinated for a variety of reasons. I'm not judging any of those reasons at all. Rather, for me, it triggered the question, our question, as you see there on the shared screen, is there a moral obligation to get vaccinated against COVID-19? Does that even exist? What would that look like if there is such a thing? And I'm not talking about sort of motivations or reasons such as this one. I'm going to get vaccinated for my own self-interested reasons, so I can go visit my 91-year-old father, so I can make sure I'm safe visiting him. Absolutely, that's a very personal reason, and it's to my own benefit, therefore, to get the shot and be protected and to protect my dad. Um, Many of us have reasons that are self-interested in that way. What I'm talking about, what I'm going to ask here in the next hour is there a good moral argument or good convincing persuasive reasoning to the conclusion that in a way I morally ought to get vaccinated, regardless of my personal reasons for or against vaccination? So that's kind of the question we're addressing here, folks. And what we're going to do a whirlwind tour. I'm going to take you on a whirlwind tour of how different ethical, moral traditions in our culture, primarily Western culture, would approach this question. So it's going to be very quick and sort of the ESPN highlight reel of how different moral theories might address the question: is it wrong or right to get vaccinated? Okay, and that's what we're going to do here. It's just the tip of the iceberg. I'm not going to explore in any depth. And for those who are interested, you will leave rather unsatisfied because there wasn't that much depth. But that's for you later on, either in a course or your own research. I'm just going to hit the tips of the icebergs of these views, and just to get like a primer on how different moral theories might approach the question. I am going to be using a book, just for your information. I will quote from this book quite a lot, by Derek Parfit, written in 2011. This is currently probably considered the most thorough, most rigorous treatise on ethical theory. So I really think Parfit's a good resource. So I'll quote from him. I'll also quote from a book by Landau called The Fundamentals of Ethics. And by the way, if you have taken Phil 110 Good and Evil, my version of it at MSU, some of this will be old hat for you if you have not, or if you're currently taking that course. So I apologize for that, but I think it's very timely. I think it's very timely, and so that's why we're going to do this. Okay, so let's start. Mask wearing. Mask wearing as an action that, and it's still the case, right? That is, at least on the face of it, for the public health. For the public health. Quoting from Atul Gawande last month, bottom quote there: masks mandates should be the last precaution removed when cases start falling, not the first. And he's warning, as other MDs and public health officials, as you know, are warning against relaxing our guard with masks before we reach herd immunity. By relaxing our guard, things could backfire very quickly. On the other hand, an individual, and this is no news to you folks, right, that it's been politicized. I'm not going to talk about how it's been politicized. That's for a different day. But there are individual reasons not to wear masks, and there are a number of them, and I went to a website that listed possible reasons. For instance, quote, face masks make breathing more difficult. Yes, indeed, that's the case. Mask wearing can cause other health risks. Indeed. Mask wearing, quote, inhibits communication and children's social development. By the way, I have a child in 2nd grade who wears a mask all day at school, and I think it's just bizarre, right? And everybody thinks it's bizarre. And who knows, maybe it is inhibiting her social development. I don't know, it's possible, right? So these reasons I've listed here, I'm not going to discount immediately. And then, of course, there's the ideological grounded reason that it somehow violates our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms, and it's an overreach of government. You've heard this before. So there are a number of reasons against wearing masks. In the same way, getting vaccinated is, right, by all accounts, by all scientific accounts, the best way to achieve herd immunity. Herd immunity is our ultimate protection against COVID-19 or any other virus that causes a pandemic. To quote from the New York Times last week, quote, an answer to the end of the pandemic lies in herd immunity, the point when enough people are immune to the virus that it can no longer spread through the population, right? And so it's really no secret, and it's scientifically confirmed that vaccinations are the best, safest way to the common good, the public good called herd immunity. Another quote from the New York Times: the pandemic is in retreat. What happens next will depend mostly on 3 factors. 1, how many Americans wear masks? 2, how contagious the new variants are. That's a wild card, right? And 3, how quickly the vaccines get into people's arms. This is February 11th. Now, just a footnote here, folks, that we have to mention is that reaching herd immunity could be an effect of two different trajectories, one of which is enough people getting infected, right? I mean, my goodness, if 70, 80% of the global population gets infected, then antibodies develop, and we could, in fact, probably achieve herd immunity that way, or through vaccination. The first way is dangerous. It will cause more deaths and more suffering. Most people don't want to go the first route, right? Herd immunity, the hard way, is through infection. That's going to cause a lot more suffering in the world. So the best way to achieve herd immunity is through vaccinations. That's pretty well accepted, I think. Okay. Yet, of course, an individual may have their own self-interested, historically based, ideological reason not to get the vaccine. You may yourself have a reason. You may know people who have reasons. Currently, if you read about this, some of the military in our country is refusing the vaccination, and they're not the only ones. A recent poll revealed that many Americans are concerned about their own long-term, short-term or long-term health effects. Many Americans are skeptical because the vaccine was developed so quickly in a year. So there's some skepticism there about the science behind the COVID vaccine. Footnote here, by the way, as you probably know, one reason why the vaccine was developed in such a quick way is that the funding for it was unprecedented. No other vaccine in the history of medical science has had such funding behind it, right? So that's one reason to explain why it's so quick. Nonetheless, there are worries about that. BIPOC communities have their own reasons to distrust vaccinations. To quote from Harriet Washington, "There was no sphere in American medicine in which African Americans did not have their bodies appropriated or their bodily tissues appropriated or were forced into research." That's from a recent book by her. Among Native American communities, there is the quote, "broader, long simmering cultural mistrust of vaccines and clinical trials felt by tribal communities as a result of historical trauma." Indeed, right? These are historically based traumatic reasons, perhaps to say no to a vaccine imposed by perhaps public health officials or the government. These are legitimate. So there is a perceived clash, right? At least a perceived clash or conflict between individual benefit and or freedom on the one hand and the public or collective good on the other. And this is just, regarding masks and vaccines, this is just one instance of, as you know, thousands and thousands of cases where it looks like individual freedoms clash with some kind of common good or collective good. And what has struck me, one reason I'm doing this talk is that this last 6-8 months has struck me as the most vivid, visceral instance of this clash since I've been alive in my lifetime. And it's really, really vivid, and it's here. So our question then, arising from that, is it possible to demonstrate with reasoning or argument, that despite individual concerns to the contrary, it is morally, ethically wrong not to act for the public good in these cases? Is it possible to reason or demonstrate that there is a moral obligation to get vaccinated against COVID-19, and that it's morally wrong not to get vaccinated? So that's the question that's arising here, right? And we're going to address that question. Now, as any good academic would do, I'm going to introduce some vocabulary and define some words so that we're on the same page, okay? So bear with me for a moment. It'll somewhat generalize the problem as well, okay? So, and also resonate in different other contexts of our lives too. Let's define a public good or a common good, or I'm going to use the word commons because commons is short and it's one word. By the way, if you're in economics or political science, you're familiar with the phrase public good um, or a common good. I'm going to define it this way: a mutually beneficial resource whose existence depends, at least in part, on the actions of those people who benefit from it. What do these include? Many things. Clean air, a livable global climate. Thus, of course, climate change is a threat to that commons, right? Clean dog walking parks, like Pete's Hill and Bozeman on the east side of town. Herd immunity. Democracy is, in fact, the commons. Wild fishing rivers like the Madison River, wild floating rivers like the Smith River in Montana. Rivers floated the Smith out there. Virtually any of the resources funded by local, state, federal tax base, Medicare, Medicaid, the national defense, unemployment benefits, locally, snow removal, the police force, public schools, right? Those are public goods. Why? They satisfy that definition, and they're publicly funded by taxpayer dollars. My property taxes make possible, with the help of everybody else, makes possible the police force, snow removal. So those qualify as public goods, and they fit that definition. These are just a few instances, right? A commons or common good, public good, is necessarily fragile. What do I mean by that? That means that for any individual in the commons benefiting from that commons, there are two actions available to them, and the existence of that commons or that public good depends on enough people performing one of these actions. So the two available actions in the commons for the individual in that group population. First, the defect action. I'll define this. Defect action is any action X such that if enough people do it, the commons will be destroyed. So, for instance, if enough people don't pay their taxes, if enough people don't get vaccinated, right, herd immunity won't happen. If enough people don't vote, democracy disappears. If enough people do not pick up their dog crap, that is their dog's crap, on Pete's Hill, which is a dog walking park, Pete's Hill will very quickly become so filled with dog crap that everyone will suffer. That commons will be destroyed. So that's the defect action. The cooperative action in commons is the action Y such that if enough people do that, that commons survives. If enough people vote, if enough people pay their taxes, if enough people pick up after their dog, if enough people get vaccinated, right? Notice in these two definitions, it's enough people, right? So sometimes you don't need everyone doing the cooperative thing to preserve that commons. Sometimes you need just enough people. And this will be relevant soon in our talk, right? Not everybody. For instance, suppose if in Bozeman, I don't pay my property taxes, just me, but enough other people do. Well, there'll still be a police force, there'll still be snow removal, there'll still be a public library, right? So the commons existence, while fragile, does not depend typically on everybody doing the cooperative action, just enough, right? And it will be destroyed if everyone does the defect action. By the way, the word defect here in the definition of that action is not supposed to mean be judgmental or negative in value at all. It's just a description. It's that action such that if enough people do that, the commons won't survive. That's it, right? So we're not right now evaluating that action morally or ethically or otherwise. We're just defining it, okay? All right, same page on that. Just to be thorough here, and again, there's much more to say about this in economics and decision theory. A defect action can destroy a commons in two different ways, because there are two different types of commons. One, some commons are threatened by overconsumption. Here, the defect action is consuming more than one's share in that commons. For instance, currently on the Madison River in Montana, hugely popular guide fishing river where a fly fishing guide will take their client down on a boat and fish the river. Hugely popular. In fact, it's become too popular because there's too many boats on it simultaneously. And what happens when there's too many boats on it is everybody's experience is ruined, right? So that commons is ruined when too many people try to consume from it. That's overconsumption. The second one, other commons are threatened by underproduction or undercontribution. That's the case with public goods funded by taxes, right? Underproduction means too few people are contributing to that. If too few people vote in a democracy, democracy's existence is threatened. That's the second type, right? Underproduction or undercontribution. All right, that's a detail. Now that we've defined some words, since vaccination is a cooperative action, right? For the commons known as herd immunity, not vaccination is the defect action. Those two fit the definitions we just gave. Here's our initial question refined. Is it morally right or wrong to defect, that is, not get vaccinated in a commons? That's the question refined. Now, there's an important note here. It's about legal law, right? Obviously, human societies, most historically, have created and will create legal laws to ensure that enough people cooperate, such as the IRS, right? People are scared shitless of the IRS. Why? Because if I don't pay my federal taxes, I get audited and I could be punished or jailed for tax fraud, which is awful for me, right? So because there's a legal law, I'm going to cooperate in that commons and pay my taxes. Fear of legal punishment works. But some commons, like democracy, for instance, in the United States, cooperation is not guaranteed by threat of legal punishment. You can get fined in the United States. You cannot get fined or jailed for not voting, right? It's up to individual choice, which is interesting. Think about that. That's not true in other countries. Belgium, Brazil, Australia, and 19 other countries, there's a threat of legal punishment if you don't vote. So in those countries, what they've done to ensure that enough people cooperate in the commons known as democracy, we're going to create a legal law to punish those who defect in that commons. It's interesting, right? Because there's different ways of doing that, I think. Think about monetary incentives, perhaps, for cooperating, like a tax break on your federal tax form if you vote. That'd be interesting, wouldn't it? The United States does none of that. We leave it up to individual choice. But by doing that, right, then it remains possible that not enough people vote, and democracy is screwed. That's why we're asking the more fundamental question, is there a persuasive moral underpinning to the legal laws that try to ensure enough cooperation? And folks, with vaccination, COVID vaccinations, I'm not going to get fined or jailed for not getting vaccinated, right? Not right now. It's up to my choice. And it's also the case that my school kid, my daughter, who's in second grade, there's no legal law saying she has to get vaccinated against COVID. There is a legal law saying she has to get other vaccinations, right? Otherwise, she cannot attend public school, but not COVID. I think there will be, by the way, in the future. So our very limited aim here is to explore different forms, traditions of moral reasoning for determining the moral status of defecting in a commons, and then to assess their strengths and weaknesses. Okay, now I just have to make a little footnote here because I'm anticipating some of you objecting that moral reasoning is useless, that we make moral judgments by intuition or emotion, and so what's the whole point of trying to reason or argue to moral conclusions? Some theorists in the discipline known as moral psychology, this is a growing discipline that's a crossover between philosophy and psychology, such as Jonathan Haidt. For you and Texan critics, you know what I'm talking about. They doubt that moral reasoning can play any significant role in forming moral beliefs. They have argued that our moral judgments derive primarily from our emotions or intuitions, and that the best our reasoning rationality can do is to, quote, fabricate clever justifications for moral intuitions derived from millennia of multi-level selection or from other emotive centers in our brain, such as tribal affiliations, politically, ethnically, religiously, or otherwise. E.O. Wilson is famous for arguing this. Now, these theorists may be correct. This is not a time to assess those theories. However, I will go boldly forth here and buck the trend. Moral reasoning can matter and should matter. I will indulge in what Haidt calls the rationalist delusion, quote, the belief that we can obtain moral knowledge by reasoning. All right, that's just a little bit of a digression, but yeah, that just to let you guys know what's going on in the field there. Okay, so our first candidate for a traditional form of moral reasoning, and let's see what this traditional form would conclude regarding whether or not I'm morally obligated to get vaccinated. Utilitarianism, which you've probably heard about a little bit. The general moral imperative, according to utilitarianism, is this. What's morally right is the action which, on balance, creates more happiness than suffering, more good than bad. Famous quote from John Stuart Mill. The mandate is to create the greatest good for the greatest number. Here's the reasoning then for defecting in a commons. Cooperating in a commons does the most good for the most people. Defecting does not. Therefore, it is morally right to cooperate. It's morally wrong to defect. Thus, morally right to get vaccinated, morally wrong not to. That'd be the general utilitarian reasoning, whose conclusion is it'd be right to, wrong not to get vaccinated. How strong is that? By the way, there's a number of nuances here with utilitarianism that we will not go into. So I'm bypassing all that. But I want to focus on one possible weakness. Here's a possible weakness with that type of reasoning. Suppose a person defects but also free rides. As a person does not get vaccinated but also free rides. They don't get vaccinated, but enough other people do get vaccinated, such that herd immunity is reached, and we all benefit, including the person who defects. In this instance of free riding, the person who defects is not harming anyone or subtracting from the common good. Therefore, on utilitarian grounds, they are doing nothing wrong. Let's take a moment to explore what free riding means. The original title of this talk was The Ethics of Free Riding in the Pandemic. I thought we would explore this in detail, but now I think not. So, but I do want to sort of take a slight detour here, because this is intrinsically interesting and relevant, but we won't spend much time at this depot. So what exactly is free riding? Here's a general definition from Stanford Encyclopedia. Someone who benefits from a commons or public good without contributing to its production. That's a very succinct, nicely succinct definition of what free riding is. For instance, right? I don't pay my property taxes in Bozeman, Montana, and I get away with it. I'm not caught, say, right? So I pocket that $4,000 and put it toward my kids' tuition, say, college tuition. So I benefit from not cooperating, from defecting, but everybody else pays their taxes, so all the public goods are available to me, and the commons is not destroyed. That's free riding, right? By definition. So free riding is the case where the person who defects also benefits from the public good. And for them to benefit from the public good, enough other people in that commons have to contribute their share. That is, they have to cooperate. A more exact definition of free riding then is this. Defecting in a commons when and only when enough other people cooperate. I'm going to read briefly from a passage from Landau's book here that says it nicely. Real quick. Okay. Free riding occurs when lots of folks are cooperating in a way that brings a common good. So long as enough people are chipping in, this benefit can be enjoyed by all, even those who refuse to help out. These are the free riders. They are getting a free ride by exploiting the efforts of others without making the sacrifice themselves. The contribution to a commons that any single individual makes is negligible. Democracy will not crumble if I decide not to vote. The park won't be totally spoiled if I drop my gum wrapper on it. Pete's Hill will not be destroyed if I'm the only one who doesn't pick up my dog's poop. So why make the sacrifice? I am getting something for nothing. How could that be irrational? In the case of herd immunity, right, we know that not the entire herd, so to speak, or population, has to be vaccinated against a virus for the entire population to be protected against that virus. This means, obviously, that an individual in that population would not have to get vaccinated just in case enough other people do get vaccinated in order to be protected against the virus. So free riding in the commons known as herd immunity is quite clear and quite vivid, right? And it's very, very possible. By the way, just as a instance here you may have experienced, suppose you have a group project assigned to you by a teacher in high school or college, and there's 5 of you on the team, and you have to complete a project together, and you'll all be graded on whether the project is completed or not. 4 of you on the team work hard at it, and you work hard at it enough that the project gets completed quite well. 1 person on the team, 1 out of the 5, doesn't do crap and goes skiing instead. It doesn't work, but because the project's completed, they also get an A, even though they didn't contribute a damn thing. That's free riding, right? Because that person who benefits from the commons, in that case the project, didn't contribute, but still gets the bennies from other people. That's classic free riding. I don't know if that's happened to you guys before. It's happened to me. I was one of the suckers who did all the work. Hence arises what has been labeled the free rider problem in political science, sociobiology, decision theory, economics, and here moral philosophy. Yeah, this is a famous and much talked about, and much for some people troubling phenomena that the free rider seems to get more than their share without contributing, but at the same time doesn't harm anybody, right? And that's kind of the wrinkle. So the bottom line here is the utilitarian approach is vulnerable to the free rider problem, right? If the moral mandate is to create the greatest good for the greatest number, it doesn't necessarily mean for some people that they have to cooperate. If enough other people cooperate, right, they can defect and not harm anyone. In fact, by defecting, they create more good in the world because they benefit doubly from defecting and from the commons. All right, so we could spend a lot more time on this, but we won't. We'll just chalk it up as a possible weakness with the utilitarian strategy. There are other weaknesses too, by the way. Okay, second candidate, the social contract tradition. I don't know if you folks experienced this, but in the last 6 or 7 months, in the discussions about mask wearing, and there have been many, about other collective actions, often people will say in a sort of casual way, well, the social contract demands that you wear the mask to protect everybody or you get vaccinated. This has been a discussion. So the phrase social contract has been thrown around rather casually and loosely in order to try to say that you really should wear a mask or you really should get the vaccine, right? We're going to take a second to explore exactly what the social contract says, and then evaluate it. So here's a definition of moral right and wrong based on the social contract tradition. Actions are morally right because they are permitted or required by rules or laws that free, equal, rational people would agree, consent to live by, on the condition that others obey these rules as well. And that's a quote from Landau. Accordingly, an action would be morally wrong when prohibited by the rules to which we consented in the social contract as free, equal, rational people. That is sort of the backbone of social contract, of moral obligation derived from a social contract. That's sort of the idea. So more specifically, here would be the argument from social contract theory why not getting vaccinated is morally wrong. First part, we all consented or agreed in the social contract not to defect in the commons, because the commons benefits all of us. Presumably, we would agree in the social contract to cooperate and not to consent. Not to defect. Second part, not getting vaccinated is defecting. Defecting is morally wrong from the above argument. Therefore, not getting vaccinated is morally wrong. That's the outline of a social contract argument for the conclusion that you should, morally speaking, get vaccinated, or you could put in there wear a mask too. Basically, that cooperation in the commons is right and defecting is wrong. You could run this right for democracy. You could run this for any larger commons. You could run this for global climate change in the same fashion. However, here's one of the initial protests to that sort of reasoning. Did any of us actually consent to these rules? When did you sign the social contract? Did any of you? The broadly humans? Sure, you signed your rental agreement. Yeah, I signed my mortgage agreement too. I did that. I consented to those rules in that contract, but did I ever consent to a social contract? And what would that look like? If not, it would seem, quote, that we are not really parties to any such contract, and so are not bound to obey its terms, right? In what sense are we parties to a broadly human social contract? I don't know. That's the open question, isn't it? And what would consent or agreement really mean here given that question? This is a worry. Moreover, some vulnerable groups in the United States, such as the BIPOC community, have had in the past, if not the present, damaging policy, actions, mandates imposed on them without their explicit consent. Individuals in such groups, then, will be particularly vehement that they have not consented to the social contract, and so might legitimately protest, whose social contract after all? That's not mine, right? So there'll be a serious question here about who's party to this so-called contract, especially from groups who've been excluded or who have been involved without their explicit consent in policy. This is, as you know, in the United States, for some groups, this is historical trauma. So this is a serious, serious problem. To finesse the objection, though, to finesse the protest, social contract theorists over the past 60 years or so have ignored actual consent, because actual consent runs into the previous questions or problems, and insist instead on a kind of hypothetical or imagined consent. Quote, the social contract that fixes our basic duties is not one that any of us actually consented to. Rather, it is one that each would agree to were we all free and rational in seeking terms of mutually beneficial cooperation, right? So a hypothetical, imagined type of consent or agreement is what I would have agreed to in an imagined contract situation. And then in 1971, John Rawls, in this famous book, added the detail that you and I, as contractors in the social contract, must imagine ourselves behind a veil of ignorance when we agree on rules, so as to ensure fairness and unanimity of agreement. What's the veil of ignorance? Behind the veil of ignorance, I don't know who I am, have been, or will be in the community, in the population, society governed by the laws or rules that we create in the social contract. I'm ignorant, in other words, of particulars about me that make me a particular individual. I could be anybody. I could be anybody. From behind the veil, I'd have to put myself in the shoes of anyone in the world governed by the rules created in the social contract. I would have to consider or occupy that perspective when agreeing to any rule whatsoever. As Rawls argued, and others since Rawls, thousands and thousands of academics, this would be the only way to make the rules fair to everyone in the world. Parfit summarizes this idea, I think, nicely. He says this: everyone ought to follow the principles to whose universal acceptance it would be rational in self-interested terms for everyone to agree if, here's the big if everyone had to reach this agreement without knowing any particular facts about themselves or their circumstances. Thus, I would have to forget, behind the veil of ignorance, when I enter into the social contract, I would have to forget that I'm heterosexual, Greek American male, and all of the other particulars about me, right? Upper middle class, etc. All those things that make me who I am, and instead place myself in the shoes of any individual whose interests, history differ from mine, including those who would object to the cooperative act in question. Yeah. And this, Rawls and many other people feel this is the only way to make the contract situation fair, because it would cancel out, right, all the biases and inequalities that currently exist in the world, and we'd all be so-called free and equal rational beings trying to agree on rules to live by in society, in the world. That's where, by the way, social contract theory is currently, trying to figure out how to do that, if it even makes sense. So here's a criticism. The demands on our imagination may be too much. How could I possibly imagine occupying the perspectives of all the affected parties in the contract? We're talking about a global contract here. Moreover, even if I could, what rule or policy could possibly satisfy all perspectives or interest groups, right? So I place myself in the shoes of, say, a mother of three who lives in Mississippi, who's lower socioeconomic class, say. And I'm trying to come to agreement with everyone about rules that she would, because I have to be in her shoes, that she would want in her own self-interest. But then there are thousands and hundreds of thousands of other interests that would compete with that. How do we do that? You can possibly imagine that. By the way, just think about how difficult it is that in Washington, D.C., senators from different states have to agree on rules to govern the United States, right? A senator from South Dakota is going to have represent a different interest group from a senator from Connecticut, right? And as we know, legislation in D.C. is a snail pace, right? You can never agree on anything. That's this reality. So imagine trying to do that globally with a social contract. This seems to be difficult. All right, that's a criticism of social contract theory. Generally, the serious difficulty of imagining hypothetical or agreement or consent. To quote Parfit, social contract theory would have to defend the claim that everyone would have reached agreement on these principles, and this claim is very difficult to defend. Absolutely, very, very difficult. Okay, so that's the roadblock to social contract theory here, I think. Now, I'm going to do the impossible and try to clarify Immanuel Kant in 5 minutes. If you walk away confused, then I don't blame you. So here we go. Third candidate, Kant, German philosopher a long time ago, over 200 years ago. However, has a strategy, a type of moral reasoning that's, I think, tantalizing and attractive if we can understand it. Kant begins with the question, what if everyone did that? And then follows a type of logic to a conclusion from that question. What if everyone did that? He calls it universalization. So third candidate, Kant's reasoning. Generally, To conclude what's right or wrong according to Kant, and here it's just a very simple statement. An action is morally wrong if I cannot rationally will that it be universalized, and morally right if I can rationally will it be universalized. In Kant's language, act only on that maxim whereby thou canst will that it should be a universal law. That's very confusing. It's very vague and nebulous, and it seems not to help whatsoever. So our job right now is to unpack it a little bit. To that end, first, it's still very confusing. In a commons, I cannot rationally will that defecting be universalized, that defection be universalized. Therefore, defecting's wrong. Assuming that not getting vaccinated is defecting, the argument looks like this. I cannot rationally will that not getting vaccinated be universalized. Therefore, not getting vaccinated is morally wrong, and I have a moral duty to get vaccinated. In the simplest or fewest words, that would be the Kantian argument for why it's morally wrong not to get vaccinated. But that's still very, very unclear and wordy and confusing. So I'm gonna try to make it a bit more concrete here. Okay, see if this helps. Imagine a person who, for their own personal reason, be it fear of their own long-term health effects on them of the vaccine, be it ideological reasons, be it BIPOC reasons, does not want to get vaccinated, but who at the same time desires that the commons known as herd immunity be achieved in order that they too can be protected from the virus. So this person we're imagining has their own personal reason not to get vaccinated, but also wants protection from the virus through herd immunity. So wants the commons to survive, but at the same time does not want to get vaccinated. They want to defect, but they also want to benefit from the commons. They wonder whether getting vaccinated is the morally right thing or not. Then they consult Kant. Who consults Kant? Well, this person does. And they have to ask this. Kant would say, ask this question. Can I universalize my maxim without contradiction? That's the question to ask. Can I universalize my maxim without contradiction? Again, that seems really vague and weird. Here are the steps that Kant would have you go through. Okay. The maxim, what is this maxim after all? The maxim is the description of the action in question. In this case, not get vaccinated, which is also synonymously defect. Second, to universalize this maxim is to ask this question. What if everyone did that? Imagine a world where everyone does that thing. In this case, where everyone does not get vaccinated. Everyone defects in that particular commons. That's to universalize the maxim. What if everyone did that? Third, then to ask, in that world I've just imagined where everyone does that, can I get what I want, namely both that I don't get vaccinated and I benefit from herd immunity? That is, in the world where everyone does not get vaccinated, can I get both of those things? Or in Kant's words, can I will this maxim without contradiction? Fourth step, evaluation step. No. Why? Because I reason that in a world where everyone does what I do, namely not get vaccinated, I cannot benefit from herd immunity. My desire that everyone do this conflicts with my desire to benefit from herd immunity. What results is what Kant calls a contradiction of will, which he says is irrational. So I want two things that clash. One, I want to act on my personal reason not to get vaccinated. But if I try to will or desire that everyone do that same thing, I will not get what I want, namely the commons or herd immunity. So there's a clash there. Kant calls it a contradiction of will or irrationality, an inconsistency. Therefore, conclusion, it's wrong for me not to get vaccinated. That's a very, very quick, and I'm afraid to say probably unclear summary of Kant's steps. Ask, imagine, reason, and conclude. Parfit sums this up nicely, I think. Generalizing the Kantian reasoning to any defect action in any commons. It goes like this. If no one contributed to such public goods, that would be worse for all of us than if everyone contributed. We could not rationally will it to be true that everyone rather than no one acts on the maxim, don't contribute, or acts on the maxim, don't get vaccinated. This is what Kant's trying to say right here, right? Whether that makes sense. Why is this weak? Or is it weak? Well, it's only as strong as a person's willingness or ability to universalize. That is, what if everyone did that, right? And then to follow this reasoning through its end, and also to give a hoot about rational consistency. Someone's got to be concerned about having their desires and will consistent, to be rational in this very specific, unique Kantian way. If you don't care about that stuff, then this is not going to be a persuasive form of moral reasoning at all. Also, you may now be scratching your head regarding the last slide and say, what exactly is he talking about, right? But maybe the light bulb will go off if you take an intro philosophy course. I don't know. That's Kant. All right. Fourth candidate, the golden rule. You're saying, where's the golden rule in all of this? Here it is. The golden rule is really a formula of sorts, right? It's a type of moral reasoning, but it's also kind of a formula. Plug in the variables to the formula. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or the same, don't do unto others as you would have them not do unto you, right? That's the golden rule. That's the sentiment. First, praise for the golden rule. Let's not forget its power and its ubiquity across human cultures, right? E.O. Wilson. The golden rule, as perhaps the only precept found in all organized religions, is fundamental to all moral reasoning. High praise indeed. Here's another. Rabbi Hillel, the Judaic tradition. Do not do unto others that which is repugnant to you. All else is commentary. Right? This is the rabbi saying, that's all you need to know. That's all you need to know, right? And by the way, some other wisdom traditions and religious traditions basically say the same thing. That's all you need to know is the golden rule. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case, but it doesn't mean it's not incredibly powerful. So here's the reasoning. If we're going to use the golden rule, here's the reasoning. If the conclusion is that it's wrong not to get vaccinated. Were I in another person's shoes with whom I interact socially, I would want anyone who interacts with me socially to be vaccinated against the COVID virus for self-protection and herd immunity. So if I'm in contact with other people, if I'm visiting a friend or going to work, right, and I ask myself, is it right or wrong for me to get vaccinated? Well, I have to put myself in other people's shoes who are affected by me. And if I put myself in somebody else's shoes, I would probably want me to have been protected and make it less possible or probable that I will transmit the virus to them. The golden rule seems to conclude with that, right? And by the way, also mask wearing too. I think if you use the golden rule to try to conclude that mask wearing is right, you probably come up with the same, right, the same conclusion. The golden rule, by the way, is not without its difficulties at all. There's lots of complexities and nuances here that would have to be worked out. Yeah, just one little instance that I experienced with my wife, with the golden rule sort of backfired. I was thinking about I wanted to give her a surprise birthday party. It was like 5 years ago. And I used the golden rule. I said, well, I'm going to put myself in her shoes, right? Do unto others as you have them do unto you. And ask myself, if I were her, would I like my spouse to throw me a surprise birthday party? And I said, damn straight I would. I love surprise birthday parties, right? So I used the golden rule. I placed myself in her shoes and asked myself, how would I like him to treat me? Well, yeah, good. It's right to throw a surprise birthday party. Guess what happened? She hates him. So, right, the golden rule, with the golden rule, what do? Do you put yourself in the shoes of the other person as you, or you try to be them, right? It's not clear. So the golden rule has there's some need to be ironed out in some ways. Okay, the fifth candidate, a divine mandate. This is often called, by the way, the divine command theory in ethical study and in culture. And here's the reasoning. Or the monotheistic traditions, including Judaism, Islam, Christianity, the monotheistic higher power commands I get vaccinated. Therefore, I morally ought to get vaccinated. It's a very simple one premise argument in moral reasoning, right? Where the idea is, the background theory is that what this higher power commands is right, what this higher power prohibits is wrong, period. But notice it's still a form of reasoning, right? It still is, right? Because we're trying to conclude with a moral conclusion here, often labeled divine command theory. The Pope, the current Pope who speaks for Catholicism, in last December, a couple months ago, said this: we cannot allow the virus of radical individualism to get the better of us and make us indifferent to the suffering of other brothers and sisters. Christmas 2020. The Pope, who, according to Catholic theory, has the closest access or best access to what that God commands for us humans. And by the way, he's asked the Vatican to get vaccinated, it turns out. Apparently, that God is commanding that we do that, which I think is really interesting. So that would be a moral argument or moral reasoning for why, if you buy into the divine command theory, this God really does exist, and this God does create morality by their commands, then this argument would be persuasive. Right? If you buy it all, but you got to buy all that, right? Okay, so that's divine command theory, and it's interesting, right? Because that doesn't depend on any social agreement between humans. It doesn't depend on a conception of the greatest good for the greatest number, etc. I think there's some logical and sort of logistical advantages to its simplicity. Yeah, but again, you got to buy into a lot of machinery here to to run with it. Okay, that was our whirlwind tour through moral theory, utilitarianism, social contract theory, Kant, the golden rule, and divine command theory. These are, by the way, 5 of the most probably influential, long-standing traditions in Western culture, determining and creating moral rules for our culture and for individuals also. And I'm not gonna. If we had a lot of time here, we would assess what's weak and what's strong, if any of them are strong. But the question I want to leave you with is, for you, are any of these convincing? If so, which ones? Do any of these work? Like, or somehow for you, make you say, oh yeah, that's right. That's why. And if none of them work, then the answer to the question whether there's a moral obligation to get vaccinated is not clear at all. Whether there is one, maybe there isn't one actually in the end, right? So I want to say this kind of in conclusion is, if there's an answer to that question, it's probably going to come from one of these 5 approaches, but I don't know which one. And first of all, I don't even know if the answer is yes to the question. Okay. But that's the best we can do at this point. Ryan, is there any reason other than selfishness that one ought not to get vaccinated? Absolutely. Ryan, go back to the BIPOC community, right? Where if I'm a member of a group, say the African American community, who have been, in fact, mistreated and violated historically, yeah, there might be I'd hardly say it's selfish to say no to a vaccine, honestly. So that might be one answer to your question. I'm also hesitant to use the word selfish too as a motive for a defect action. I think that selfishness has connotations that aren't necessarily, that defect actions are not always motivated by selfishness.
Mr. Demetriades, would you say,
Yes.
I know with the divine
Yeah.
piece where like following the Pope saying it's you have a like a religious
Yeah.
obligation
Yeah.
to get the vaccine, could that work in terms of like celebrity? If a celebrity that a lot of people admire and follow said the same thing?
Interesting. Yeah. That's a good question. Yes and no. Yes, because of the power of authority. Uh, that has psychological power, but I'm not sure it has much logical power because there's the appeal to authority fallacy in logic. But second, I think the answer in my mind would be no, because um, the Pope's word is for believers, for Catholics, most Catholics. The Pope's word is God's word, whereas Matthew McConaughey's word is not necessarily God's word, right? I mean, that's not, whereas the Pope has a position in the Catholic hierarchy where the Pope is more or less speaking for God. But a Hollywood star is speaking for themselves, right? Does that make sense? So I think to analogize from the Pope to, LeBron James or pick your favorite music star, it doesn't work. Hope that answered your question.
Absolutely. We've got two more
Uh,
questions in the chat.
yeah. Let's see, Hope. Should we be taking more action as a country to understand the conversation around vaccines to dispel some of the falsity spreading? Yes, we should. And scientists and politicians and public health officials are really tearing their hair out for not having a better publicity campaign regarding vaccines safety, etc., its effectiveness. Yeah, right? Would you agree? And then the next one. Have you heard anything in the argument against masks, vaccines, or other that appeals to the idea that if one is not acting in self-interest, that it must be more, that if one is not acting in self-interest, it must be morally okay. So morally okay because not self-interested. No. Why? Because it seems like for most people, it not being self-interested is not a sufficient reason that it be morally okay. You need, I think, an independent reason for its being morally okay, besides that it's not in my self-interest, right? Because I can do a lot of things that damage me and not in my self-interest that are not necessarily morally okay, right? I think, folks, as an aside, how masks became politicized, we know now is going to be the subject of many, many dissertations and articles and books in the next 3 or 4 years. I'm convinced. Vaccinations, right? We're living through a historical period where we're seeing the beginning of, I believe, in your lifetime and your children's lifetime, COVID-19 vaccinations being mandatory, certainly in public schools and other places too. Do you agree? Yeah. So as I said in the talk, the legal law is going to step in, I think, and require that. Mason, it would be interesting to discuss where on the moral line those people who stole vaccines before they were supposed to get them. They are taking away from those who need the vaccine, but they are also helping the process of herd immunity. Absolutely, Mason. That's a great point. They're doing the cooperative act because they themselves are using the vaccine before their, so to speak, before their turn, right? Yet um, they are taking it away from the more vulnerable populations, perhaps, like the elderly, healthcare workers, public school teachers. Yeah, I don't know how to navigate that morally because you got two competing, right? Two competing moral mandates. One is herd immunity, and the other is make sure that the people who are most vulnerable get vaccinated first. And I don't know where that clash goes, frankly.
This has also been something that's been floating around, I think, in like moral conversations, but in
Yeah,
areas that are really dependent on tourism for the economy.
yeah,
With COVID, obviously, opening up is very controversial because while it does help the
yeah.
economy, it's still putting those people at risk. What do you think about that? Like, how does one?
But one thing we didn't explore here that needs to be explored is Kate is the clash between opening the economy and getting people back on their feet working, the tourist industry, sports venues, athletes. And on the other hand, keeping ourselves protected before herd immunity is reached. Right? That's so again, I just have to throw up my arms and say, I don't know. I really understand and sympathize with the argument that we do have to open up parts of the economy, including the tourist industry, before more people lose their jobs, right? On the other hand, I don't think I don't think we should be relaxing our guard until 60 to 70, if not 80% of the world is protected. Do you agree with that, or I don't know, you know? But can we hold out? I don't think we can hold out. Okay, Caleb, where do you think the power struggle of herd immunity by infection versus vaccination originated? Wow, where did this? Oh, I don't know. I think um, Caleb, in no one particular place, but it's just maybe no, maybe to go back to Kate's point. Maybe those who were most interested in opening the economy would argue that let's get herd immunity by infection before the vaccination rollout, right? Before the rollout, let's the economy is worth enough that we can allow or accommodate more deaths and more hospital overload by more infection. I think that's where the infection argument stemmed from. I think, right? Yeah. I don't know about you folks, but a lot of kids have lost a lot through not going to school, and I don't know. In retrospect, in the end, there's been so much damage done. There's been so much mental health damage done to folks who have suffered from mental health due to isolation. Um, that I think we're going to have to assess the risks and the benefits, the pros and the cons of the shutdown afterwards in about a year. I don't know. There's been a lot of damage done to a lot of people.
I think you might have a new class in about a year or two, Mr. Demetriades.
Well, it turns out I'm teaching a pandemic course in July,
Really?
two, two credit 4x4. We had one in December. We had a two credit intense in December at the Honors College, right? And we're going to do it again in July with a kind of, okay, where are we now? Where are we now in the pandemic in July?
Wow,
So
that sounds pretty interesting.
yeah, yeah. So that's what we're gonna do.
Does anyone else have any questions for Mr. Demetriades before we head out?
Yeah. Boy, thanks you guys.
Thank
I hope it
you.
made some sense. Hope you know.
I enjoyed Kant in five minutes. That was great.
Oh my God. I don't.
Yeah, thank you. Everybody's saying thank you in the chat. We really appreciate having you give the
Great to be
presentation.
here. Great to be here, everyone. And yeah, thanks, Kate, for having me.
Of
And enjoy
course.
the rest of the night. Okay,
Yeah,
thank
you
you.
too. All
Bye
right,
bye.
I'll stay around for a minute as everybody heads out. Make sure you
Okay.
hit that attendance link if you have not already and you need credit. But thanks for being here tonight. Thanks again, Mr. Demetriades.
Yeah.
Thanks, Don.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Don.